Okay, everybody, this is what we're going to be doing for this week. We're going to focus on chapter 1 of the Irony book. So, read chapter 1. We're going to talk about revolutions and our founders. And in turn, we're going to also look at an objective from our syllabus where we're going to analyze the motivation of the founders of the Constitution and assess the contribution of the American colonial experience to contemporary U.S. political culture and how our government is set up. Going forward, next week, we're going to look at the Articles of Confederation and the weaknesses in those, the development of our Constitution, the separation of powers doctrine, and then we'll also focus on direct democracy, which is something that is unique to California and other states, but mostly something that we use here in California. So next week, please read chapter 2 in the Irony text. Have a lecture, and I'll lecture about the chapters in this class, and then there's also a study guide attached to each week to help you prepare for the weekly quizzes that we have. Okay, so out of the first chapter of Irony of Democracy, it kind of talks a little bit about the development of our country. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk about something called the iron law of oligarchy. We're going to talk about elitism. We're going to talk about pluralism. We're going to talk about how they overlap. And then we're going to talk about how elitism currently occurs in our representative democracy. And then we'll try to explain why the title of the book is The Irony of Democracy. It's a really interesting question. So, what is democracy? Democracy is basically government by the people, for the people, all of that stuff. And in order for our democracy to survive, we need the elites to be able to stay in control and also keep the masses happy. And that's how our democracy functions. You know, we could always vote the elites out if we're unhappy with it, but as we'll see, there's going to be some passivity to the way people get involved in voting and in participation. So, elites are the ones that have power, the masses do not have much power. Power, and I would always like to find, there's a couple of definitions of power. Power is deciding who gets what, when, and how. And I also like to kind of look at power as getting somebody to do something that they don't want to do. And I think that's another form of power, right? And this whole concept of these theories that we're going to be focusing on, we're going to be focusing on elitism and pluralism. And elitism is the theory that we're going to, primarily take a look at, where society focuses on the few who have that power, their values, their behavior, and their demographics, and what makes the, kind of the elite circle up. And it could be anybody from a Trump to a Biden to an Obama to a Bush down to a Kardashian, and then all of us. So elites will govern all parts of our society. They're going to be small in number and perform functions. They'll monopolize power and enjoy the advantages that power brings to them. Individuals, they'll focus on maintaining their positions as elites. As we know, if somebody is an elite that has, not maybe experience some of the hardships of the real world that many of us have, they might not do so well. I always like to say, maybe let's take Kim Kardashian's wealth and her fame away and give her $2,000 a month or let's say $3,000 a month to live. She probably wouldn't know how to do it. So it behooves them to become and to stay a part of that elite circle. And as the group, elites are going to agree on the rules of the game, and they may even change the rules of the games at times to preserve their political and their social system. Now, I don't want to seem really kind of pessimistic about this, but it'll start to make sense when we go through all of this. So the basis of elite consensus are the sanctity of kind of things that our country was built on. Kind of the John Locke belief that we all have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property. Right? So if we talk to elites and see what their consensus is about what may be sacred here in our country, they may say individual liberty, private property, and limited government. And when we talk about public policy, when we use the term public policy here in this class, that's basically like laws and programs that are put into place for the American people. Generally, when we talk about elites, their demands don't necessarily reflect the will of the people, much like how we kind of come to learn is the vital part of democracy, but rather their own interests and their own values as elites. Doesn't mean the masses are going to be repressed. The elites are going to assume that the masses are passive, apathetic, and ill-informed, and I don't think that is too far of a stretch to make that assumption. We don't have a lot of people voting. Why? Because they're apathetic. People don't participate in politics. Why? Because they're passive. A lot of us are ill-informed. It's hard to be able to tell who our representative in Congress is or who our two senators are. A lot of people don't know this, and the elites kind of rely on the masses, kind of being ignorant. And I'm not going to use ignorant kind of in a negative term here. Ignorance just means you're not totally knowledgeable about a subject. So obviously there's going to be people who aren't totally knowledgeable about parts of politics, and that kind of plays into the elites relying that the masses are going to be passive and apathetic and ill-informed. And these elites are going to influence us more than we influence them. So when we talk about popular participation in the allocation of values in society, one thing is individual dignity that we rely on. When we talk about democracy, obviously, when we talk about values, those are resources that we may be entitled to as a people. But in our world, in our kind of our situation here in the United States, we do go very much off of a majority rule type feeling. But kind of within the classic Federalist 10 belief of James Madison is that in order for a democracy to be truly functional, you need to have majority rule, but at the other end, you need to have respect for the minority. And we're not talking about ethnic minority, anything like that. We're talking basically people who are going to be in the 49% below in any type of vote or any type of decision by Congress. So the majority will rule here in the United States, but the minority's rights have to be protected. And that's why we have our system of courts and all that stuff. And we'll look at that in the future. A lot of our belief system here in the United States is based off of John Locke's classic liberal theory. And classic liberalism focuses on the fact that we have inalienable rights to life, liberty, and property, which are independent of the government, and the government's purpose is to protect that liberty and be a neutral arbitrator, right, in making decisions or making judgments against people. And with that, we form a social contract with the government. And basically what that says is the contract is that we as citizens will give up certain rights as part of that social contract, but in order for the government to effectively govern us, they have to protect our life, liberty, and property. So we consent to government rule, but in turn, the government needs to protect our life, liberty, and property rights. Go ahead and move on a bit, and we talk a little bit. Here's a good side-by-side for you to look at. Kind of the differences between classic liberalism and modern liberalism. Remember, classic liberalism is not the modern liberalism that we have today. It's very different. If we wanted to kind of compare classic liberalism to an ideology today, it'd probably be a libertarian type thought where, you're socially liberal but economically conservative. So looking at the side by side, we could see the differences between classic liberalism versus modern liberalism. And we don't really want to get these two mixed up. While classic liberalism is going to influence both conservatism and modern liberalism, it's totally different type of liberalism that exists from now, and I want to really enforce that. So when we talk about the meaning of democracy, everybody is supposed to be equal before the law. We're also supposed to be equal politically. One person, one vote. All our vote counts the same. Right? Now, there's kind of a disparity in thinking about equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. We're going to come and revisit equality of outcome later in class, but equality of opportunity is kind of, equity is trying to get people to be able to be whatever they want to be in life without any type of barriers, and the government is supposed to ensure that. So equality of opportunity is developing the extent of one's capabilities where nothing gets in their way to pursue a life of happiness. The founders also believed that government will rest on the consent of the governed and envision decision making by representatives of the people. And this is where we get our representative democracy ideas from. We elect people to go to Washington, D.C. to make decisions based off of our interests. But as we're going to look in future chapters, we're going to see that sometimes these decision makers will make decisions that benefit their own self-interest or special interests. And we'll talk about what special interest is in a minute. Or actually later in class. Probably right around when we get to talking about interest groups. Direct democracy, we're going to address it in a little bit, so go ahead and hold off of that. So we talked a little bit about ruling by the consent of masses through institutions of representation inevitably leads to elitism. So people like Chuck Schumer, Nancy Pelosi, Mitch McConnell, Devin Nunes are all part of Congress, but they're also part of the elite no matter what party they're a member of. So, technically at times we have a trust in government, but as we could see by this graph, the trust in government has gone down significantly since the 60s. If anybody asks you, do you trust your government? I think a lot of people would say no. And that's not a bad thing. I think that's one of the things about being a part of this country is that you need to question your government. And I don't think there's anything un-American or anything wrong with that. So let's talk about pluralism. And pluralism is kind of the other side of the theory that we're going to be working off of. So the belief in pluralism is that democratic values can be preserved by having groups come together and argue and advocate for their positions. Voters exercise meaningful choices in elections, and this might lead to a point where new elites can gain access to power. Mass participation is not possible. Decision-making must be accomplished through elite interaction rather than individual participation. And these countervailing centers of elite power can check each other and keep interest from abusing this power. And we're going to talk about, kind of Madison Federalist 51 and the separation of powers doctrine and his belief that one portion of the government can't be stronger than the other. So the legislative branch can't be stronger than the judicial branch. The judicial branch can't be stronger than the executive branch. And we're going to actually get into a discussion later about whether or not there are institutions within government that are more powerful than the others. They're not supposed to be, but I do think there's one that has kind of evolved. And, this is a scene from Black Panther, Wakanda Forever, right? And this is the opening scene where, not the opening scene, but a couple of minutes into the scene where they have the different tribes from Wakanda come together and argue pluralism and argue about different rights and different goals. And when I saw this movie, this showed me and kind of it kind of let a light bulb off in my head where I say, hey, this is a aspect of pluralism. So if you've seen the movie, you'll understand what we will.
A misidentified Wakandan artifact was stolen yesterday from a British museum. We have learned Ulysses Claw plans to sell the vibranium to an American buyer in South Korea tomorrow night.
Claw has escaped our pursuits for almost 30 years. Not capturing him is perhaps my father's greatest regret. I wish to bring Claw back here to stand trial.
Wakanda does not need a warrior right now. We need a king.
My parents were killed when he attacked. Not a day goes by when I do not think about what Claw took from us. From me.
It's too great an opportunity to pass.
Take me with you. We'll take him down together, side by side.
They need you here, protecting the border.
Then I ask, do you kill him where he stands? Or you bring him back to us?
You have my word. I will bring him back. We will proceed with the mission.
What I'm talking about. If we look at this side by side, it compares elitism versus pluralism. Go ahead and take a look at it and the differences. We're going to go ahead and skip elite distemper. So let's talk about something called mass unrest. The masses are vulnerable to appeals to intolerance, racial hatred, anti-intellectualism, maybe a class antagonism, anti-religious, and violence. And we've seen this. You've seen decision makers and members of Congress, or people that have been in the Oval Office, try to appeal to the masses by maybe, in a sense, scaring them, or in a sense of maybe repressing what the masses can read or what the masses can intake. Because remember, once you start learning stuff and you start opening your worldview, your mind will open as well, right? And we have demagogues at times where, these are people that try to diminish or delegitimize the system. Trump may be considered a demagogue, Bernie Sanders, even AOC at this time. So the belief is democratic values can only survive if there is an absence of mass political activism, or that kind of that segment or that issue of people not participating, people being passive. Mass unrest will inspire elite repression, and we're going to kind of look at this through the course of our summer, where we're going to see that at times when there is a national crisis, or there's a war, or there's an economic downturn, at times elites will repress our rights. And we may be okay with it in some instances, but we'll go ahead and really analyze the fact of, is there stuff that we are prohibited from doing because the government says no? And then we may think that's an inalienable right, like speech or assembly or dissent. Can the government repress these rights that we see in the Constitution based off of law and order? All societies are governed by elites. Elite theory seeks to explain the ways elites function in our democracy. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump to talking a little bit about the colonial experience. We're going to go back and forth between political science and history. This is the history part. So we had, during the colonial experience prior to the Declaration of Independence being signed, we had royal colonies. And royal colonies were ruled by an administrator or by a governor that was appointed by the King of England, right? So they were kind of subservient. And here are some examples of states that were royal colonies. The government in the royal colonies was based on the principles, they were ruled by British monarchs, and the king had control all over unsold public lands, and the governor had the power to allocate those lands. But remember, the governor was going to be very subservient to the crown. And we also have charter colonies, right? A charter colony is governed by a written document. A charter might be some type of constitution or some type of rule of law. A charter is written from the sovereign power of a country that bestows certain rights and privileges to that colony. Charter colonies were written contracts between the crown as well as the American colonists, defining the share each should have in the government, and were not to be changed without each party consenting to that change. And if we look at this was a model for the U.S. Constitution. And we see 3 states here that would be considered charter colonies. The final one that we have is a proprietary colony. And these were territories granted by the king to one or more proprietors who had full governing rights over that area. They were granted governmental powers over a tract of land, and proprietary colonies were run under a colonial charter agreement, which were reviewed by the king. The leaders here were called governors or lord proprietors, and Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Delaware are good examples of this. And here's a little bit of a chart to show you, and I think this is a good illustration. Now, we also had a sense of a monopoly over mercantilism. And basically, the English crown had a monopoly over the seas, over the land. The Navigation Acts were a series of English laws that restricted colonial trade to England, so the colonists weren't able to trade with other countries. This was enacted in 1651 and lasted to throughout the time until 1663, and then it was eventually repealed. They reflected the policy of mercantilism, which sought to keep all benefits of trade inside the British Empire and to minimize the loss of gold and silver to foreigners. So, in a sense, kind of hoarding all the riches, in a sense. At the time, a gentleman named Edmund, well, at the time, the English crown practiced something called salutary neglect, or a healthy neglect. So a lot of the times when in the mid-18th centuries, North American colonies weren't really regulated that much. And if they were, it was laxly enforced by the king. So there was kind of a healthy neglect, and this was coined by a gentleman named Sir Edmund Burke. And then, we kind of started to see a pattern of revolution here. In order for the British government to pay off the debt from the French and Indian War, they started enacting taxes on the colonists, which really upset the colonists because they didn't have any representation in government. One of the first things they did was the Sugar Act. This was an act on that set a tax on sugar, molasses, and imported into the colonies, which impacted the manufacturing of rum. The Sugar Act also taxed wines, coffees, cambric, printed material, timber, and iron were included in the products that could be only traded with England. So you could see the colonists, they could not really profit too much from any type of merchandise or any type of goods that they had. We also had the Currency Act and the Stamp Act. The Currency Act regulated currency in colonies. The Stamp Act was opposed on all American colonists and required them to pay a tax on every piece of paper they used, whether it was a ship's papers or some type of legal documentation or a license or a newspaper or other publications. And even playing cards were taxed. Kind of the tipping point was the Tea Act. This was passed by English Parliament on May 10th, 1773, and it granted the British East India Company tea a monopoly on tea sales in the American colonies. And remember, when we have a monopoly, at times, businesses that are monopolized can charge as much as they want. Right? This was used as a revenue stream to help England recover from the cost of the French and Indian War. Eventually, revolution came out, and we kind of came toward the Declaration of Independence, written by Thomas Jefferson, that was very much influenced by John Locke. And it kind of also creates what is called the American dilemma that we'll look at in a future class. Jefferson wrote, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by the Creator certain inalienable rights, that among us these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So you can also see kind of Jefferson's, kind of savviness in maybe tweaking that John Locke theory from life, liberty, and property to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Because if we all had an individual right to property, then more people would have been enfranchised. Because remember, at that time, the only people that can vote were white men with property. So, we originally had the Articles of Confederation kind of as a governing document. But the Articles of Confederation was basically a treaty between sovereign nations, right? It established that firm league of friendship among the states for their defense, security of their liberties, and protecting the general welfare of the people. These articles proved to be weak, right? At this time, the powers delegated to the United States were, kind of what we have now, declaring war, sending and receiving ambassadors, and so on. The states had the powers to regulate commerce and levying taxes. So when we talk about regulation and taxes here in this class, they're going to be looked at as revenue generators for the government, right? The government will make money off of this. So, one thing to make, to collect taxes. The states were making money through collecting taxes and regulating commerce, and there was really no way for the American national economy to develop. As part of, the Articles of Confederation, there was no executive or judicial branch, so no checks and balances. Weak state governors, no powers of the central government to tax or to regulate interstate trade, so no revenue generators. And then we had Shays' Rebellion, which exposed the government's weakness, where a series of protests in 1786 and 1787 by farmers actually scared the government. Rebels tried to capture the federal arsenal at Springfield. They were a bunch of people that were debtors, and back then, if you had debt, you could possibly go to debtor's prison. At that time, they captured the federal arsenal at Springfield, Massachusetts, harassed merchants, lawyers, and supporters of the state government. And this scared politicians because they really had no way to approach this. So as a result of this, we started to have a situation where a new constitution was going to be developed. The Alexandria Conference in Maryland and Virginia met and dealt with navigation and commerce issues. The Annapolis meeting in Maryland met, where we had 12 delegates from 5 states adopt a report outlining these defects that we just talked about. They were looking to revise the Articles of Confederation, but instead they wrote a whole new constitution. We also saw a form of the national elite. These are one of the tipping points, or the starting point. Sorry, not tipping point. The starting point of an elite system here in the United States, where we had George Washington, who was at the apex of our elite structure, and a lot of these governing people had experience, making key decisions in government, controlling Congress, participating in the Revolution, and so on. A lot of them were educated at prestigious institutions, which kind of plays into that elitism. And a lot of them were wealthy. And you can see what industries they were a part of. And they had a really strong national view, right? And when we look at the word nationalism, it's going to be used in a couple of different ways. When we hear the word nationalism, or when I hear the word nationalism, I think of the Nazis, right? But also, it could be classified as an intense love for your country, where you're willing to maybe compromise some of your values. And they all had a strong belief that we needed a strong national government with the power to exercise its will directly on the people. Kind of, taking out that instance where the federal government could go in and form that social contract with people to get them to consent to being governed, but in turn also protecting their rights. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the next chapter. What we'll do on some of these is that okay, everybody, welcome to week 1